joined from Jerusalem by Haviv Rettig Gur of the Times of Israel. Good morning, Haviv. Thank you for joining me again. I really appreciate that you do so much American media, from Dan Sinwar on Monday to MSNBC to my show. I think it's great. You're perhaps one of the most reasonable voices I've heard out there in persuading people about Israel's point of view. Are you doing this for the government, or is this just Haviv saying this helps the hostages and this helps Israel, so I'll do this?
I'm doing it because I'm getting called by your show and MSNBC. And no, I don't work for the government. I haven't worked for the government ever in my life. And I guess I was a soldier once. And I disagree with a lot of things the government is doing. And in Hebrew, I mostly tweet and complain about the government.
Well, I appreciate that you do this, because there are a lot of people talking in America who have no idea what they're doing. Let me begin with the hardest question, Aviv. I listened to you and Dan Sinwar on Call Me Back yesterday, and the first question I wrote down is, there is no happy ending to this situation. There's only the least worst ending. What's the very least worst ending of this that you can imagine?
Well, there's an incredibly happy ending. Hamas abandons its understanding of us, interpretation of us, that believes that we will magically disappear, we will evaporate, we will move to some random other place in the world, and decides to leave Gaza rather than force us to pull it out of Gaza. And Gaza is taken over by moderate Palestinian political forces keen on developing Gaza. Not the kleptocracy under Mahmoud Abbas in Ramallah, but there are extraordinarily good, competent, caring leaders in Palestinian politics. They are always pushed aside by the major forces like Hamas, like Fatah. There is a good scenario. And then there are the forces in Palestinian politics that will make sure that good scenario doesn't come about. But those are choices, and that's the choice Hamas makes. Hamas has spent 17 years in control of Gaza and has done nothing but build the underground city in which it is now hiding behind and beneath its civilians. Hamas is nothing other than that. It literally has no other strategy, no other infrastructure. It did nothing for Gaza except that. And if that changes, if that choice that Palestinian politics has made changes, there are many wonderful scenarios. If President Biden were told that for $10 billion of investment in Palestine, America could put the Palestinians on a radically different trajectory, I suspect he'd find those $10 billion in Congress, and I suspect Congress would find $100 billion to have the Palestinians have that better future. If this war translates into genuine global empathy and support for a Palestinian polity that isn't Hamas, that's only a good thing.
Haviv, is that within the range of possibility? I have friends in the UAE. I have friends in Bahrain. I know that there are moderate Gulf states. Elon Musk referred to them yesterday, but they're standing back because it's such a nightmare of poisoned minds. Is there any scenario where you see them stepping forward to run the Strip on behalf of the Palestinians until the Palestinians develop a new elite that will do it for them?
No. Anybody who takes over Gaza after Israel removes Hamas, assuming the war continues the way it has gone, assuming Israel is as implacable as I think it is, and assuming Hamas is removed, anybody who tries to take over in the immediate aftermath of that will be seen by Palestinians, not just in Gaza. In Gaza, they'll probably like a new regime. They hate Hamas. We have polls on this. But in the West Bank, they love Hamas for what it's doing to Israel, and because out of a sense of empathy for Gaza, the West Bank doesn't want what's happening to Gaza to happen in the West Bank, but nevertheless, the Palestinian diaspora, American Palestinian activists, have all found ways to support Hamas, despite kind of understanding that in Gaza, the perception is Hamas brought this devastation on them. But anybody who takes over will be seen as taking over riding Israeli tanks. In other words, Israel will be even if they don't like Israel, even if their politics aren't pro-Israel, they'll be seen as coming in at Israel's behest. No, there has to be an indigenous Palestinian political solution after Hamas. Hamas, of course, will fight tooth and nail to prevent anything like that from ever happening.
The pause that was extended for 2 days. I noted yesterday that Qatar and Egypt announced it first, then America announced it, and Israel held back. I do not think the United States should be ahead of Israel on any of these announcements. What was your reaction to that? Was that America leaning on Israel to accept the extension of the pause?
I don't know if it was America leaning on it so much as America being part of sort of the support network that to allow the Israelis to start to consider them. The Israelis have a very simple point, and they've been making it from the start, and it's what the agreement is. If the hostages keep coming out, the ceasefire remains in effect. When the hostages stop coming out, the ceasefire is no longer in effect. Defense Minister Gallant said yesterday, when the ceasefire ends, the Israeli forces will resume the war on Hamas more strongly than it has been until now. The Americans have asked us today, and I think the Americans understand that, and I'll tell you why. They asked today, or I think they asked yesterday, but it was reported today that Israel act differently in specific ways, not sort of in a generic please don't kill civilians, which
Okay.
everybody would like to not kill civilians, but in specific ways create these kinds of humanitarian corridors in the south when the war continues in the south. All these details that lead me to understand that the Americans understand that the war will continue in the south.
That's very good news. Do you think this matters to Hezbollah in the north, that they see the implacability of Israel? Do you think that it will deter them, not only now, but in the future, from attempting what Hamas actually executed, the massacre of Israelis en masse without distinction between child and adult, civilian and military? Is Hezbollah watching and learning, do you think, Haviv Rettig Gur?
Absolutely. Something even more interesting is happening. Iran has taken steps to ensure control over Hezbollah decision making so that Hezbollah doesn't accidentally escalate to a point where it faces a war. Iran wants to hold Hezbollah in its arsenal, in its quiver, so to speak. The purpose of Hezbollah in Iranian grand strategy is that when the Israel Iran war turns kinetic, right now it's a bunch of spies and bombs and secrets and cyber. When it turns into a kinetic ground, air war, but actual bombardments of each other, Hezbollah is a force multiplier for Iran, and so it doesn't want Hezbollah lost for that next war, right? Israel would like Hezbollah not to be a threat in the north, and so it doesn't really mind if Hezbollah escalates to the point of a war accidentally. So yes, I think Hezbollah is deterred. I think Iran is deterred, but it's deterred tactically, not strategically. Strategically, it is doing nothing but building for that next war, and all of Lebanon is watching helpless as its fate is being sealed by Hezbollah doing so.
Now, we have leadership elites in all of those. Khamenei in the IRGC in Iran. We've got Nasrallah and Hezbollah. And then we have this Sinwar fellow. My first question, is Sinwar mad? I mean, does he actually think he's winning or that this was a good strategy? Or is he just an evil, depraved soul who wants to kill? Or does he actually have intelligence and Hitlerian sort of grasp of tactics and strategy, however flawed they were in the Second World War? Or is he just nuts?
Yeah, no, he's a deeply strategic man, a deeply strategic thinker. I keep sending people to look at the FLN in Algeria, who, in an 8-year war with tremendous terrorism and abuse, kicked out the French colonialists after 130 years. Well over 1 million French citizens had to leave Algeria in 1962 when the FLN won that war. And that response to that war among Palestinians was the founding of the PLO. In other words, a lot of the Palestinian national movement and this generation of Palestinian leaders grew up on the example of Algeria kicking out the French. And one of the lessons, two things kicked out the French. One is that the terrorism raised the cost for staying beyond what the French were willing to pay. And the second was that the French military response, the French probably killed 500,000 people in bombardments of villages, and there were literal torture dungeons established in Algiers, in which FLN fighters were just disappeared into. The French response was so cruel that cruelty undermined the French ability to explain back in France, back in Paris, what the heck they were doing in Algeria. And so both sides, the cruelty imposed by the terrorists and the cruelty forcing the colonialists to be cruel, both of those things undermine the colonialists. And that's how Sinwar, I think, understands what's going on. He thinks that Israel is going to be weakened by killing our civilians, and he thinks that Israel is going to be weakened by forcing Israel to cut through Palestinian civilians to get to Hamas and not being able to explain that to Israelis. And all of that's going to
But there
fail
comes a
him.
point. Aviv, I heard you make the argument
Yeah.
about the French analogy before, and I've been reading Daniel Gordis's book on Israel, and I know a lot more about Zionism now. There is no France for the Frenchmen to go to. The Israelis can't go anywhere. That's where I see it breaking down. Does Sinwar really think he can move Israel?
Yes, he thinks that. And it's the tragedy of the Palestinian cause for a century. They have been talking about us since before they called themselves Palestinians. If you go back, in 1914, you have these newspapers where they talk about themselves as Palestinians. But 10 years before that, they don't really. It's just how borders were drawn. I'm not making a statement about Palestinian identity or nationalism, but I'm just saying that for 100 years, literally since the 1910s, they have seen Jews immigrate very slowly, very gradually, and they have talked about us as colonialists and understood us as imperialists and understood us in all these words and all this verbiage, and they never really developed a theory of mind of us. They don't really think of us as people who think and feel and experience. They think of us as this kind of in 30 years of peace talks, no Palestinian leader has ever spoken to the Israeli people. Hamas has a theory of why we will be destroyed. It doesn't actually have an understanding of our internal politics and experience. So, for example, what do the Palestinians not understand about their anti colonial strategy of terrorism? They don't understand that roughly 800,000 Israeli Jews, if they go back to where they came from or where their grandparents came from, would be going back to Baghdad. Now, I don't think they've had that
Or
conversation with
Yemen?
Baghdadi or
Or
Yemen,
anywhere?
or it's
Yeah.
half of us would be going back to the Arab world. Right.
Pause right there for a
And
second, Haviv. I've
yeah.
got to take a break for the Salem News Channel and the radio network, and I'll be right back with Haviv Rettig Gur. Follow him on X, the site known as Twitter. I got to talk to him about Elon Musk. I got to talk to him a lot about, but I'm going to come back and talk to him during the break about the BBC. We'll put it all on the podcast. We'll be back on the radio and the Salem News Channel in just a moment. Stay tuned while I take this break. With Haviv Rettig Gur, we'll continue and we'll put it on the podcast so you'll hear it all, and I'll play it later in the program or tomorrow in the program. Stay tuned, America. Welcome back. I'm talking with Haviv Rettig Gur. Haviv, people that I admire and respect, very smart people like William Dalrymple, who's been in my studio, and I've spent hours talking about him about Afghanistan. He posted yesterday, or Tom Holland posted, a note that this all began with Arthur Balfour. That's so ignorant. It began with the Romans destroying the Second Temple. But I don't know what to do about this when smart people say stupid things about Israel. How do you respond to that? What do you attribute that to?
If you believe that the affairs of the world are set down by tiny elites sipping champagne in halls of power in Geneva, then you think that Balfour created the Jewish state because the British government, because of politics having to do with the Americans in World War I, wanted, and a little bit of anti-Semitism, wanted to get rid of its Jews, created the Jewish state. The Zionist movement wasn't, imperialist Britain didn't give the Zionist movement the territory. It was used by the Zionist movement. And when Russia, the Jews were fleeing Russia, the Zionist movement used what are called the capitulations during the Ottoman periods, which are immunities given to Russian citizens in the Ottoman Empire to advance Zionism. And when German Jews showed up, they used German, whatever they could. They used whatever was available. Small nations trying to survive will use whatever international politics they can to try to survive. And if you then conclude that international politics created them, well, that's very silly. By the time the UN voted in 1947 to establish a state of Israel, the Jews were not moving anywhere. And the Jews of the Arab world were about to be kicked out en masse in the most perfect ethnic cleansing of the 20th century, to almost the very last man, woman, and child across 20 countries. And so you think that if the UN hadn't voted that way, what would have happened to these people? They would have evaporated, disappeared. Nobody would have had to think about them. The Jews kept in the DP camps after World War II for 3 years. They're behind barbed wire, right? American high school kids are taught that the Americans showed up and liberated everybody. But Israeli Jews know that their grandparents were still behind barbed wire on German soil 3 years later, and that barbed wire was patrolled by British and American soldiers because the world didn't want them, so they had nowhere to go. The Jews created Israel. The world didn't want the Jews, and the Jews' response was Israel. And no, it wasn't Arthur Balfour.
Uh, is there any way to teach that effectively, given not just social media, but the general collapse of the willingness to learn history apart from identity politics now? Haviv, I know that. You know that. I'll bet you not 1%. We have a minute to coming back and rejoining the network.
I'm Israeli. I was raised to think that it doesn't matter what the world thinks. I don't know how to teach the world. I know me, and I'm not going anywhere.
That is well said. Stand by. We'll be right back because I got a lot to ask you about the adult Gazans and their complicity. I've got to ask you about your comment to Dan Sinwar on Call Me Back yesterday that war is not math. And I believe that's very important for people to understand at this point. War is not math. Things can go very wrong or very right, but Israel is being as restrained as possible. Stand by. I'll be back with Haviv Rettig Gur right after this. Welcome back, America. I've still got Haviv Rettig Gur from Jerusalem. Haviv, adult Gazans, how complicit are they in the terrorism they are inflicting on the Israeli hostages? I'm thinking about somebody's got baby Kafir if the baby is alive, and they're not turning them over. How complicit is every adult in Gaza with this horror?
There is no question that every adult is not complicit. There is no question that huge numbers of Gazans are absolutely the victims of this moment, profoundly victimized by Hamas. Hamas murders, Hamas oppresses. The victims, the hostages, include Muslim young men and young women who have been held incommunicado for 52 days. Aisha al-Ziadni is a 17-year-old Israeli Muslim Bedouin girl held by Hamas for the last 52 days with no sign of life. There is no question that Hamas is as much an enemy. I think Hamas is an enemy of the Palestinian cause in sort of grand strategic ways, but individually, specifically, it is a horrific, oppressive, disastrous, murderous organization to Palestinians. And we have polls from October 6th, literally the day before, that showed that Palestinians despise Hamas, not for any issue having to do with Israelis, just for its own internal oppression in Gaza. Having said that, there is huge support among Palestinians, ordinary Palestinians, for the October 7 massacre. There is huge support for inflicting pain on the Israelis. There's huge support for holding hostages to get out Palestinian prisoners, and that is true, and that has always been true. The Palestinian political world doesn't have another story. There are essentially two ways that nations have achieved independence, liberation, what have you, in the 20th century and in the 21st century. One way was anti-colonial terrorism, and it worked. It worked in some places. It worked spectacularly. That is the path the Palestinians have chosen disastrously for them year after year after year, generation after generation. There is the other way, which is nonviolence. Nonviolence that robs the enemy of their excuses. Robs, in this case, it would rob the Israelis of the explanation for the military rule in the West Bank, for example. That path the Palestinians have never chosen. There have been very small movements within the Palestinians that have tried things like that, but they've always happened alongside massive sustained violence. So it doesn't work on the Israelis if it's a tiny movement next to a massively violent one. The only story the Palestinians have to tell about themselves is that story of massive terrorism and violence. I want to, if I may, I'm sorry to talk so long, but I want to say one more thing. The Palestinians are having trouble getting away from Hamas's strategy, from terrorism, as a liberation strategy, no matter how much it fails them. And the reason is what economists call the sunk costs problem. The sunk cost problem is when you have invested so much in one direction that to change direction becomes impossible, even if it's failing. This is true of companies, and this is true of national movements. And so if it's true that terrorism can't work on us because we have nowhere to run away to, the whole anti-colonial premise doesn't, you want to call me a colonialist as a curse, fine, enjoy it, but tactically it won't work. If that's true, then every martyr, as they call them, shaheed, every act that has ever been, every single suicide bomber the Palestinians have ever produced has something named for them, some street, some soccer field in Palestine. Every one of those stories becomes a story of folly and stupidity and murder instead of heroic martyrdom and liberation. And so to not lose, to not all the sacrifices of the Palestinian story become empty and stupid, they have to stick to the
Yeah, I've
story.
never thought of sunk costs in this context. Megan McArdle wrote a great book on this, The Upside of Down, a few years ago that made me think about sunk costs in almost every situation, but I've never thought about it in this situation before. And that makes it very difficult to change. I saw that Hamas, and I try and use the analogy of Gestapo because Americans culturally understand what it is. Their Gestapo operated in the West Bank on the weekend and executed 2 Palestinians on the West Bank in rather horrific fashion. How deep is the Gestapo, the enforcement of Hamas in the West Bank, Haviv?
In the West Bank, it's a collection of scattered militias deeply disrupted by Israel that occasionally can produce a terror attack, occasionally can take over some neighborhood in some Palestinian city, but don't actually have the capacity to do more than sort of pinpoint terrorize. The point of those deaths of those two young men, by the way, we have no evidence that they were actually in any way informants on Israel. There are a lot of Palestinians who hate Hamas, and they inform on Hamas to Israel not because they love Israel. But we don't know anything about that. We've tried to find out. It's all intelligence. Who knows what we could even find out if it were true, but we don't have any evidence. But the point, even if they were not actually, the point that Hamas is making is this is what will be done if you are an informant. So it was an attempt to terrorize the Palestinian population. When you are a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Hamas is a
Hold
terror
that thought. I
organization, and
got to
every
come
problem
back.
it's ever had, including in Palestinian society, it's solved with terrorism.
One more break, and I'm going to come back and ask Habib during the break, is there an Adenauer anywhere in Palestine? Because that is, to me, I got to ask him about war is not math as well. I'll get 2 more questions in with Habib, and I'll try and trap him into coming back again and again and again. But he's doing Israel's best work. Dr. Oren and Haviv Rettig Gur are doing Israel's best work in the American media, and it's important because it's slipping here. It's slipping almost every day. I can see it slip. Don't go anywhere, America. I'll be right back. And Haviv Rettig Gur, well, all of it will be broadcast, so stay tuned. I'm back with Haviv Rettig Gur. Haviv, yesterday in the Dan Sinwar podcast, Call Me Back, you noted that international law benefits the powerful. That's absolutely true. I took it. I teach it. I know exactly what it does. You're absolutely correct about that. It does. And so I reject all the proportionality arguments by people who don't know what they're saying or the context. But I do wonder whether or not there's someone who might not return Palestine and Adenauer to the nations that benefit from international law. Because if they ever did, there would be arguments that could be made about how much of the West Bank they should receive in the final allotment of the two-state solution, if there is a two-state solution. Is there an Adenauer? Is there anyone like that? A Yoshida? Anybody that you can identify, or does identifying them endanger them?
No, there have been. There have been. There was a gentleman named Salam Fayyad, a World Bank economist, a professor at University of Texas, who became prime minister of the Palestinian Authority briefly. America supported him. He began to root out corruption. He began to create a serious and responsible budget. And he began to build out the institutions of statehood. And he was very quickly pushed out of Palestinian politics by the forces that be, essentially because he was trying to weaken the regime and establish something more liberal and more open in the West Bank. It's important to remember that while Hamas is this horrific, oppressive regime, Mahmoud Abbas is a slightly less horrific, slightly less oppressive, but nevertheless pretty terrible, oppressive regime. And so Salam Fayyad was someone who, when he ran in an election, I believe he won something like 3% of the vote. Voting among the Palestinians is something that doesn't happen often. It follows tribal lines and clan lines and religious loyalty lines. And so it's not really a healthy democratic world in that sense that we can really measure by our standards, both Israeli or American standards. So there are such people. There are activists, phenomenal activists. I won't name them because if I name them, it'll only hurt their PR. But there are activists on the ground working on building out civil society. I once spoke with a Palestinian activist, no fan of Israel, spent some time in an Israeli jail, who said to me, I can't come to peace talks with you. I can't even sit at the table because when we sign something, I don't have the state institutions to implement it and ensure it and control it. I have to build out my society. I'll meet you at that table in 20 years, and I'll be stronger and you'll be sorry because he'll negotiate, squeeze more out of me, right? That was how he put it. Me being Israel, not me, Haviv. And he goes around the West Bank establishing literally women's knitting circles, literally just walking around the West Bank establishing civil society, because you can't trust the West Bank leadership of of the Palestinian Authority. Of course, you can't trust Hamas, and so what he is doing is actually going around trying to establish a social life, a civil society in Palestine that can be built out. There are such
Uh,
people, and they
I
are
have one
crushed
last
under
question,
Hamas and
Aviv,
Fatah.
and I have 5 minutes for you to answer it in, so I want to give you the time. You said yesterday to Dan, war is not math, and you cited Pickett's charge, and I had just seen Napoleon. I thought about Waterloo. I thought about every big battle ever. What did you mean, and what do you want, and especially an American audience, to understand when they look at Gaza that war is not math?
When you there are two sides in war, or sometimes there are six sides, but let's imagine a war between two sides. Each side is trying to surprise the other. That's fundamental. That's what's actually happening. And when I say each side is trying to surprise the other, I mean that if you build the war one way, if you're fighting the last war, armies are usually fighting the previous war. In the next war, the enemy is going to try in every way to surprise you. So, for example, the Israelis revealed to the world and to their enemies that when they kill too many civilians on the other side, in the Grapes of Wrath operation in Lebanon during Prime Minister Shimon Peres's time, there was a UN compound bombed and dozens of people were killed. And the Israeli strike was, not, it was supposed to, it was an accident. That wasn't the target. But nevertheless, there was this UN compound built, and that essentially ended the Israeli war effort because massive international pressure came to play. Once Palestinian civilians, were proven to be a major limit on Israeli warfighting, they became the heart of Palestinian military strategy. And that's why Hamas has, according to its own leadership, hundreds of kilometers of tunnels and bunkers under Gaza. And so war changes based on how the enemy changes, right? And how the enemy conducts itself. That's how the war will be shaped. In other words, Hamas right now is trying to carry out a terrorist strategy as a government. It is trying to be a terror group, attacking the enemy, hiding behind civilians, but it actually controls territory and it actually runs that territory and controls and really owns that economy. And it controls and owns that economy in a way that has done nothing but bend the entire economy to Gaza to creating this massive underground network that forces the other side to cut through the civilian population in order to win the war. Okay? Hamas has essentially made the heart of its strategy massive Palestinian death toll if Israel ever tries to come for it. Until October 7th, and this was my argument, there was nothing that the Israelis could imagine that Hamas could do that would make Israel pay that cost. Pay that cost in Palestinian lives, which you don't have to believe Israelis are good people, translates into massive diplomatic and international costs for Israel. Israel couldn't imagine taking on that cost for anything. There is no danger that Hamas could pose. After October 7th, that was no longer true. In other words, Hamas made Palestinian deaths its essential strategy. That's what that underground tunnel system is about. No terror group in the history of the world was capable of building that because it wasn't also a state-lit and government and city-state kind of situation like Hamas has. So this is a unique foe. No army in history has ever faced a foe quite like this. That was kind of a terror group in some ways, but a government and army in other ways. And that combination means that Palestinian civilians are the shield, but Hamas came out from behind those Palestinian civilians, did something that makes us no longer able to tolerate it as a threat at any cost. If we incur massive international sanctions, we're still going to destroy Hamas. After October 7th, we can't afford not to. And so that combination has turned Gaza's civilian population into a devastated place. I mean, there are many large parts of Gaza City that are just literally uninhabitable. But the war effort will continue until Hamas is gone. And so they have created a whole new kind of battlefield. If you assess the civilian death toll in Gaza only by comparing it to Mosul, to the American operation against ISIS in Mosul, we're not quite caught up to that. We don't even know the death toll from Mosul. It's anywhere between 10,000 to 40,000. But if you compare, that was over 9 months, right? The Americans, when they chased after the ISIS fighters, they tried to avoid in the city, they tried to avoid in buildings, and they tried to find them above ground. They had
But they
dug a few
couldn't.
tunnels and bunkers.
But they couldn't.
They could. We
Haviv,
can't find.
I'm on a hard
Yes.
out, so I've just got to say
Yeah.
thank you. I hope you will keep coming back. I want people to go listen to you on Dan Senor's Call Me Back podcast yesterday, and please keep coming back. I greatly appreciate it. I think you do just about as good a job as anyone else I've heard in explaining the reality of what is going on in Gaza today and why Israel must do what it is doing. Thank you, Haviv Rettig Gur. Follow him on X at Haviv Rettig Gur. Read him in the Times of Israel online for free. Thank you, Haviv.
Thank you.